Hi there, so this is my second video in my Can It Be Done in React Web series. The first one was the Spotify scroll video, and the next one is also one that I've picked up from the famous Can It Be Done in React Web series. So let's dive into it. So this is the second one, and it's inspired by this blog post from Monzo, and then that's been picked up by the Can It Be Done in React Native blog. So it's these 2 or 3 different card animations. So first one on the left, we have this one where when we first load up the page, we get this fanning out effect. Looks like we're rotating them with a center somewhere around here, and then we can see as we choose one, we go from that fanned out shape back into sort of being collated, and then when we switch between them, once we're collated, we lift them up and bring them to the front. So that's probably 3 different animations to do, which looks like a fun challenge. I'm really happy with how this one came out when I had a go at it before. Potentially nicer than the React Native one. So let's dive in and see what we've got. So to start with, not the focus of this video, I've just set up this basic layout that we see on here. I've just used plain rectangles as my cards. They could equally be images of credit cards. That doesn't make much difference to the actual implementation of the animation, so I've left it as that. Based on React Spring, create React app again, but with React Spring and style components brought in, plus prettier with my preferred config again, just because I like it. So now let's go into the basics of the changes I've made so far to get this. I've set all of my heights to 100 just so we get that native effect of taking up the whole page. Again, converted to style components. I've got my cards stored off as constants with colors and names. So names, just the nice versions of the colors to use here. These 3 colors are all CSS HTML standard colors, so we can use them as named colors rather than having to work out what they are. I've declared the card size as a constant in terms of pixels for now. In a real implementation, maybe we'd change that depending on what we were actually trying to do. And for those that don't know, credit card size tends to follow the golden ratio. Have a look if you don't know what that is, and it just gives us these nice natural feeling card shapes. So if I go back to the app, so I've just set up a header and a footer in black just to again look a bit like the actual application, and then the content section is this in the middle, set up using a flexbox with this guy growing and the other guy's happily just not growing, and within the content block, so at the moment I've got 2 components. This is set up as the card display, which at the moment is just a flex container with my cards in. Cards being a simple div to set up our credit cards with that height and width, the radius and the color. Very simple. So nothing interesting going in card display. Card selector, again, reasonably simple. Just got our list of options, using the color as a key because the color is unique between each card in my thing, rather than using the index, which doesn't work as well if you I'm going to change the number of items in the array, and my options here. Don't need this anymore. That's from where before I extracted this. So we have our little swatches of each color, the option text, and in place of a checkbox I've just put a circle. This in future, once we actually allow you to select one, will hopefully represent which one is currently selected, but for now I just wanted something there. Again, I'd get a designer to give me a nice checkbox to look a bit like this thing if I was actually doing this, but I'm not too bothered about that. I'm mainly focused on getting this animation right. So we have the first of our animations that we want to put in is that initial fanning out effect, and we want to do that on mount. So if we look at the rack spring docs, the thing to use for when we want to do something on mount is use transition. So whenever items are added or removed, we animate them, which is what we want to do here. So for example, and the API for this guy is some base values in the from, and then when we enter, we give them give a new set of values, and this can be either an object, which we can see here, or it can be a function, and so that function receives each item, which I hope, is there an example? Here's an example. So we can give a function that takes each item and returns either an array of objects or a single object. We'll cut the array of objects we'll talk about in a bit. That will become useful later, but the single object is probably what we're going to be doing mostly at first. So from and enter are the things that are going to give us this ability to bring an item in and animate it appearing. So the first thing we need to do for this fan out animation is get the cards to all sit on top of each other. So that is in card display. What we're going to do so that we can keep this animation implementation distinct from the actual card component, we're going to split this, wrap this card component in a new element that is just going to handle the animation. And so to get these to be on top of each other, we're going to want these to be position fixed. No, absolute. So let's wrap our card in these items. Still need a key on the outermost item. Don't need the key on here anymore because we've wrapped it. Let's just tidy that up. So now they are on top of each other. Obviously can only see the topmost one. And also we want to put them somewhere in the middle. How we do this would again just be as this is just a sort of a normal bit of React code. It's not related to the animation. I'm going to just slightly hack it because I don't care too much about this. But if I was doing this for something different, I would probably use this card view to control, put another element inside there to nicely center it. In that case, I also might be setting the size of the cards programmatically rather than just hard coding the size of the cards. That's not. Let's just make that a bit better position centrally, just so we can. Cool. That's close enough. Could play with changing how this layout works. Probably wouldn't use this sort of fixed positioning if I was trying to do something nice. This is just normal CSS, not trying to do the animation. I want to get down to the animation. So now that we have our component position set up, what we can do first is give, just as a demonstration, give each one a different rotation. So I'm going to take the index out of here, and give the transform being rotate Z, so that is rotating the Z axis, which is going to twist it in the direction we want. If we just say for the first go 15 deg for everything, and then pass this into here. Yeah, can't type. Then we see that it has rotated, and then in our fan out example from here, we can see that we wanted 3 different rotations. So let's just try working that out. So for item 0 we want -15, for item 1 we want 0, and for item 2 we want 15. So that is index -1 times 15. Cool, so we have our rotation, but the default center of the rotation is the center of the item, whereas for our fanning effect we want the center to be somewhere off over here. The property that does that is the transform origin, which we want to be, so the first parameter is the x parameter to this. So if we go for -50%, the second parameter is the y parameter, so let's go 50%. And we can see that's given us a nice fan out effect. So if we go up to this one where we can actually inspect everything, we can see that this item has not been rotated at all, and so that is its natural position. This one rotated -15, this one by 15. So that's our fanning out layout, but we also want this to be done as an animation. So we need to work out transform and animate to it rather than just going straight there. So as we saw before, we wanted to use transition when we were looking at the React Spring docs, and we're also going to need animated. So this also reinforces why I've added an extra wrapper, because the implementation of the card I want to leave completely independent of the fact that it's being animated. So to animate it using React Spring, we need this to be an animated div. and so then we want this to be our transition. So when we use transition with an array, we get an array back. I think we actually always get an array back. But we'll see if we go and look at the docs, we'll see how this works. Oh, too far. So this is our example with an array. So in order to do this, we have our use transition. The first argument is the list of items themselves. Second argument is how to get from the item to the item key. Mentioned earlier, we were using the color for that. And then the third argument is the array that actually configures it, where we said we wanted to use from and enter. So if we use transition, so first item was the array, second item was how to get to the key from the array. Oh, not card. Oh, yeah, card.color. And the third argument is our actual values. So we wanted from. Is that correct? Yeah, so from. Could have also used initial. So this is first time base values versus base values. So we want our initial that thing to be 0 rotation, so that we initially render them collapsed. And this has to be an object. So this is now in the prop that we could pass in as a style format. So in exactly the same way as we're doing that here. The enter argument, which is this is the one where we're going to want to use the function format, because we're going to want each item to get a different rotation. So this function doesn't actually get called with the it doesn't get called with the index like it would in a map. So it just gets called with item or card. And so we can work out the index by doing index of. We always know that the card is going to be in the cards array, so that's fine. And so once we've got the index, we can just do, using the bit that we worked out before, transform. Oh, don't need that. Transform being this guy. Cool. And so this function is reasonably fast, but the key thing is that we're not going to need to run this for this function for every frame. We're going to run it once when it enters to work out what the target rotation should be, and then React Spring is going to interpolate between our from and our enter position. So if we look back at the documentation for use transition, so this suggests that when we've got our array, rather than mapping over the items themselves, we map over the transitions themselves and pull out item, props and key. So I'm just going to copy this. And so instead of transitions, ours is called items. Instead of this block, we're going to want our block. So our key is not so card, we don't have card defined anymore, but we have our key just being passed in already. Our style is just our props now, because that is going to be objects of this form or this form. And our card.color, again, card isn't defined, but item is. And then we can get rid of their version. And get rid of this because we don't need to do it twice. And work out, have we got, yeah, we've, why are we unhappy here? You match that one, you match that one. Just missed this, so it's not properly closing that tag. Cool. And now, if we look on the right, we see we do get that fanning out effect. It's pretty quick because it's as soon as this page loads. So keep an eye for it. There it is. So that's the first bit already done. So the next animation we want to do is getting them to the cards to collapse back into it together when we select a card. If we look at the original, so we collapse back together and then we shuffle, and that is when we're interacting with the selector down at the bottom. So the first thing we need to do is make this selector down at the bottom actually work, and we want that to end up in React state or some other form of state that is accessible elsewhere, because eventually that is actually going to need to be used to do something. So for example, it was enabling, one being selected was enabling the next button in the Monzo example, and presumably they're going to want to record that a card has been selected. So if we go to our app, so card display and card selector are both going to need to know about this piece of state. So card selector is going to need to know which item is selected, and how to select one, and the card display is going to need to know which card is selected. So we're going to just use a hook for this, and just use state. So selected card index. So we're going to choose them by index within this cards array, because this cards array is constant. Potentially we could do it with a unique identifier if we had one, and we're going to also get the callback. And we already declared a constant for the initial state in our constants, which was initial selection, which is imported, and that was just -1, so never one of the items in the array. So I'm going to need use state. Cool. And then let's just pass the selected card index and the set card index into the card selector. And then if we open up the card selector, so this is now getting set card index, selected card index, and was it set card? index, set card index. Cool. So we're now receiving those as properties. So selected card index. Let's just pass these both straight through into card option. And the card options are also going to need to know what their index is in order to be able to compare each option to the selected card index. And then if we look in our card option, so we have index coming in, selected card index, and set card index. So first of all, this checkbox, we want to only be selected if the index matches the selected card index. So that should make them all disappear, because at the moment we can't select any. Yep. And the on-click handler for this is set card index. Essentially, I would think about memorizing this, but not too bothered on performance. And this is just sort of is pretty close to just being a div, and performance isn't necessarily what I'm going for on this. So now, if I click one, I can choose which card is selected. So first thing though is the checkbox, the blob, very much just appears. If we're doing some nice animations, we might as well make it do better than that. So we can just have that fading in and out reasonably easily. So again, this is using use transition. From RetSpring. So if we go back to the docs, there was a specific example that was basically this, a single item being toggled. And so the arguments it was using for that were have the item initial, so the first argument is just the boolean as to whether or not it should be showing. The second argument can be null in this case. So items can be null, so the keys can be null if items are atomic. So atomic, we only have one item. And then our configuration, and we can probably actually lift pretty much all of this directly from here, because this is their classic case. We don't need position absolute, and our show variable is selected. And then for displaying that, I'm using this. So first of all, we need to wrap it in that. Not sure where this has come from. So, and then rather than displaying animator.div, we want to display our checkbox. So we can now get rid of this, because this is technically still mapping over an array. Our thing's still going to want us to be putting a key in. I'm not sure why this has come out quite like that. Copy and paste error. And just like we had before. Style is props, and that should do most of the trick, except so their example used an animated.div. So again, we need to change this to be an animated div. I'm getting animated out of React Spring. And let's see if that's worked. So we can already see there is, you can just see it fading out and fading in. It's reasonably quick, but just a nice little extra. You get a slightly dodgy effect from the fact that I'm not using position absolute. If I click too quickly, I can fix that without too much effort by switching it to use position absolute. But I think this is good enough for now. So now that we've got our selector working and nicely animated, we want to get this display to actually update based on the result of this. So the first thing we need to do is go back into here, and card display needs to know about the selected card index. It doesn't need to know the setter because clicking this doesn't do anything. So if we go back to looking at the React Spring docs for this guy, we can see there's also an update which we can use for updating elements, and again it takes this choice of either object, function or array of object. And if we look at the animation we're going for, so when they collapse back in, they don't collapse back in to being all the same. They collapse back into being slightly less rotated than each other and rotated around the center. So first thing we'll do is get it to do that. So we're receiving selected card index. And this is going to be our update key. So we're going to want each one of these to return a different rotation per card again. So again, we're going to want to use this pattern, and again we can just use exactly the same. But instead of being 15 degrees, they're now twisted by maybe half of that. So we can see that when we changed it back, when it next updated, so when this guy was next called to render, it brought everything back in. The thing that would have triggered this guy next rendering was the selected card index updating, but we can be explicit about that. So we can say if selected card index is not the initial selection, which we need to get from constants, so this is important just in case we were going to have something else that would trigger an update. It doesn't happen in our simple version, but it could do. So in this case we're going to want to return this guy, but rather than copy and paste, I'm going to declare this as a function. So that I only have to update it in one place if I change something about it. So now this is just fan out animation of index, and that's exactly what I want to return here. The other thing that we noted was, so when we've brought them back in together here and only rotated by 7.5 degrees, here we're still rotating them by a point somewhere around over here, whereas we actually want to rotate them now around their centers. Fortunately, we can override so we could either bring this bit of CSS into being in the style thing. So actually, let's do that because we're in a style tag. It has to be in that format. And let's remove it from there. This would still work even if we left it in here because the style tag overrides CSS, but let's make this property be only maintained by that. So we also want this to be doing it by the center, so that is 50%, 50%. Got my input wrong. And so then when I update, now we are nicely rotated by the center, so we get that effect. So next, so I'm going to call that, I'm going to extract that into a function again because we might want, because then we can keep this guy tidy, and we may need to use that again. So the next thing on here is that the selected item is supposed to be the centered one and on top, and the animation to bring something to the center was kicking up and coming back down in the center. I mentioned earlier that the fact that this could return an array was important, such as the fact that this guy returns an array, and that's in this multi-stage transitions section, which is what we want to do. So if we return an array, that creates a multi-stage transition, so we do multiple items in a row, which is exactly what we want to do if we want this card kicking up to the top and back down. So first thing we'll do, we'll ignore the initial, choosing the initial one for now, and we'll just handle making sure that the selected card ends up kicking up and coming back down. So we've already handled the idea of the selected card index being the initial selection. Now we're handling the case where the selected card index is this specific card. So in that case, we want to return an array where so the first item is going to be kicking up to the top right. So that is going to be using rotate Z again. and we are going to be rotating clockwise because we're going that way. So that is still a positive rotation, and we are also going to need to be setting the transform origin to, rather than be either over here or in the center, to be somewhere over here, probably off screen. So if the left hand edge was 0%, over here was minus 50%, here is 100%, then over here is 100 and something %. And we still want to be vertically centered. So if we set the transform origin again to be, say, 150%, 50%, if we just try that, then we can see that the particular selected item has flown up and right. Hasn't really flown far enough up and right. So let's, if that's rotating through around here, if we just move the point of rotation even further right, then we'll move it up. Basically, it's important that it's getting clear of all of the other cards, so that then when we're trying to make sure it comes forwards towards us, it is getting the correct, it doesn't look as though it comes through another card, because we want these to look like or behave like physical cards. So the next item in this array, because we're doing a multi-stage transition, is bringing that card back, which is easy again, because that just means rotate Z 0 deg. And we are happy to rotate around the same transform origin. So if we try that out, we can see that everything collapses and we zoom straight up, and then when we choose another one, we go up. So there's a slightly strange shuffling of the other cards, but in general the animation to move our card up and out is looking good. One other thing we can do is, it's a bit spongy, so we can stiffen it up with a spring config. Some of this is also the performance of my laptop when I'm trying to record, because it's trying to encode video at the same time, but we can already see that's much sharper. So the current problem is that when we come back down, we end up in behind. So that's easy, because that's another property that we can animate. So that just means we need to bring the Z index up to the top. Could put it in either of these or an extra one in the middle. Each of these animations ends up taking around the same amount of time, and we don't want it to, so if I first try putting it item in an array, if I first try putting it up as an extra one in the middle, you can see we just pause for a bit longer than we need to at the top. So I'm just going to put it in here, and hope, and if we check, we can see that it shouldn't end up looking as though it's coming through. Doesn't look like it's coming through the card that it's taking over, because while the Z index is on its way to 5 and the others have it unset and so a 0, it doesn't matter. But if we continue to click around and choose different items, we see that eventually everything ends up with Z index 5. So easier on this version, where you can actually see all of this. So if I choose an item, we reloaded? So if I choose an item, and then choose another item, so this guy's got Z index 5 now, this guy's got Z index 5 now, this guy's got Z index 5 now, and so Z index never gets beyond 5. The sneaky way of doing this, if we assume that we're never going to end up getting, so what we would like to do would be just add 1 to the Z index, the current maximum Z index. Unfortunately, it's reasonably difficult to. So within here, we don't have access to the actual results of the previous run. So the easier way is not a const, it's a let, is this. And so a bit of a hack, but it looks like it should do the trick. So this is just always going to increase max Z. If you didn't know, plus plus also actually returns it and increments it. Ooh, that's not working. That's always putting our item. Oh, now every item is coming properly to the front. So every time we add a new item, this is also having the nice side effect of the other items behind us always stay in the right order, and we don't see them shuffling because they stay in the order that they were originally piled up. So if we look at this now, the next issue that we've got is that, so demonstrated by this one, if we have a card other than this card selected, we have perfect overlap, when we actually would in this case want the aqua card to be rotated by minus 7.5 degrees. So this is when we're hitting this unfan animation. We need to, so this is the unfan animation is what's handling these unselected cards. So first of all, let's rename this to unselected card animation. And the criteria for this is that, so the criteria for this somewhat depends on the number of cards. I've solved the problem for 3 and only 3. If you have more, potentially the problem is actually easier because it doesn't necessarily matter which cards you display of the other 2, which other cards you display rotated. So it can't be plus, so it can't be the, so if we're at this instance, it's obvious because it's the card with a lower index gets 1 rotation, card with a higher index gets another. But if we're at this one, they both have a lower index, and if we're at this one, they both have a higher index. So it's, for this one, it's either, so it's not cards with higher, it's card with +1, and for this one, it's card with index -2. So selected index -2. So if we make this a function of the selected card index as well, and again remember, it's not critical that this function is incredibly fast or does nothing, because it's only run once at the start of the animation to work out what the animation target is, rather than being run every frame. So instead of this function, we want, so if we're hitting this unselected card animation, we've always got something selected and we are not it. So if the index, so if selected card index, if the index is selected card index plus 1, or the index is selected card index minus 2, then let's go with 7.5, otherwise minus 7.5. Partly because we've extracted this out into a separate function, it would be really easy for us to change what the logic is here. But this will do for now, while we've only got our 3. So let's try this out. So I'm not sure why on the first pass the Z index isn't bringing it to the front. We'll have a look into that. But in general, the other cards are always nicely rotated. So in this case, the pink and dark slate grey, the pale violet red and dark slate grey are both nicely rotated relative to the aqua. So let's investigate what's going on with that first round of selection. So we know that we're setting the Z index to 1. And we know that our issue is resolved as soon as we have clicked on all 3. But if we click on this, then this, then this, it starts to get it, but this one doesn't work. So this suggests something to do with initialization, because it does now work. So if we think about what the default is for Z index, and maybe go and look at some documentation, so on MDN, which is the best reference for this stuff, the default, the initial value, default value is auto. So if we look at what auto says, the box does not establish a new local stacking context. The stack level is the same as its parent. So that means unless we set a Z index on everything, it's not even getting involved in stacking. And so if we just initialize everything to have a Z index of 0, all of the cards, before we do anything, remember that our styles that we set in use transition are going to override the CSS that we're setting here. So that is creating an initial Z index for everything of 0, which is putting everything flat. And then as soon as we click on an item, that has not worked. I was hoping that would have sorted it. Let's see if the issue is it not accepting it there very nicely. So Z index of 0 here. That's better. So now because we're initializing z-index in the style rather than in the CSS, it is happily animating the z-index all the way through. So that is most of what we wanted sorted. But the remaining thing for us to do, if we refresh this guy, is the first selection. It doesn't look quite right if we compare it to the Monzo example. So we can see it first of all collapses the fan into a stack, then it starts shuffling. And we could do that because that's just an extra step in the start of that transition that we only do for the first time that we are shuffling. So we need something to represent that this is our first shuffle. So I could use, to begin with, I'm just going to declare a variable here, but I'll discuss that in a moment. Not his first shuffle, let's go with his first selection. Cool. So we want to do something slightly different to this if it's the first selection. So if we think about what we want to do, so first thing we want to do is we want to reset that flag. So we only do this the first time. And then for the selected card, we want to do bring it into the center, then this shuffle. And for our unselected cards, we are happy with this guy. So first thing we'll do is we will turn this guy into a function. I'm keeping this as a function, even though it doesn't require any arguments, because it does actually have a side effect when we do it. Which highlights that it's not a perfectly good solution, it's not a great solution, because we want our rendering is not supposed to have any side effects, but we'll look at that again in a moment. This is also a side effect of rendering, which we're not supposed to have. So, for this case of the is first selection, we want to do two different things depending on whether or not it is the selected card. So, if it is the selected card, which we could put out into another variable. So if it is the selected card, we want to do something, and then we want to do the selected card shuffle. So this is the array spread. So this is going to, because this guy already returns an array, spread those items into this new array that's going to have something else in. So what is this something else? It is effectively going into this position but for a random, without taking into account whether or not we're the selected card. So let's call this, and for the, in the other case, so if we're not the selected card, we want to do something, so some coming back in, and then again we want to effectively do this, because then we will trigger the rearrangement within our items that matches the rearrangement we do with the shuffle. This is the order in which I happen to have thought of it. Probably not necessarily the best. Handily, this being a function means I can just put it in here, and this returns a single item rather than an array, so I don't need to spread it. And so then we have, what are these two objects? And so if we look at this example, when we come back in from the fan, so when we unfan, we see that we don't change order. We just rearrange them based on the order in which they are.
Selection equals
so
ref. Import for me.
So it doesn't matter. The effect there doesn't change depending on what has been selected.
But more than the ref attribute.
So
and if you're keeping any mutual value,
these things are actually going to be
fields in classes.
The same, just as a function of the
Can't
index.
use an instance field because we're not a class, but this sounds exactly like it's telling us that we can do we can and should do what we want. So is first selection we want to.
So this is going to again.
So we've got our initial value.
We want to be in this sort of arrangement. So with the transform centered at the center of the cards. So let's set transform origin.
Let's get use
50/50.
Use ref imported.
And the rotation.
So now, because these two are shadowing each other, these two aren't in use
transform. Is like this one going
this
to be
guy's now
a
unhappy
function of the
because
index,
or like
max
this one
z is
function
not being passed in anymore.
So let's bring this in so we can pass him in as an argument to this function.
But we don't want to rotate by 15. We want to rotate by
7.5.
That was selected card shuffle. If we have a look, needs to read
are the actual
needs to get max
orders
z now. The top one, and he's allowed to. He's within this horizontal function scope.
The other
so he
two
can get it here.
doesn't
At that.
Don't actually mind.
Easiest. The difference here is that this is just be an object with a mutable property called current,
in the simple
rather than just being the property itself.
Have the
and its first selection is a constant again.
Rotated from it.
So we need
So let's try
current.
We do here. See if this
So
works.
this pulls the current value out of here. These are just plain objects that return a mutable ref object whose .current property is initialized to the past initial value argument, and the returned object will persist for the full lifetime of the component. So that seems perfect because we want to reset max z to 0 when we render this component again, and in particular we want to reset its first selection when we render it again. But there's nowhere else while we've got this component that we can unset it. So let's try that. So this effectively we're looking for this to look exactly the same. So we've got that first selection thing working correctly, and the Z index appears to be increasing happily to always put our selected item on the top.
So how does it look? So that looks like that has worked.
Looks about right. Particularly like the way that the other two shuffle nicely while the one that was being selected zooms off to the side. So that is doing what we want. The only downside of this at the moment is that we have these two side effects. So we're going to try and look at how to get rid of those. So to make these not be side effects, and also so that this guy gets reset if we mount card display again, we want them to be within here. But we still need them to be maintained between renders, so between different calls of this guy. There are a couple of handy things that we can use to store a bit of data like this. This is a slightly unusual use of one of them, but so use state and use refs both store an object between, or a piece of data between renders. The main difference between them is that use state triggers a re-render every time it changes, whereas use ref doesn't. So we can actually use ref to sort this out. So if we set so is first selection equals use ref. Oh, no, you're not going to import for me. So note that use ref is useful for more than the ref attribute. It's handy for keeping any mutual value around, similar to how you use instance fields in classes. So we can't use an instance field because we're not a class, but so this sounds exactly like it's telling us that we can and should do what we want. So is first selection we want to, it says we can put an initial value, so we can put our initial value of true, and we can do this. Let's make sure we get a use ref imported. So now, because these two are shadowing each other, these two aren't in use anymore. This guy is now unhappy because max z is not being passed in anymore. So we can pass him in as an argument to this function. So that was selected card shuffle, needs to get max z now, and he's within this function scope, so he can get it hit at that. The difference here is that this is an object with a mutable property called current, rather than just being the property itself. And is first selection is a constant again, so we need current. So this pulls the current value out of here. These are just plain objects that return a mutable ref object whose .current property is initialized to the past initial value argument, and the returned object will persist for the full lifetime of the component. So that seems perfect, because we want to reset max z to 0 when we render this component again, and in particular we want to reset is first selection when we render it again, but there's nowhere else while we've got this component that we can unset it. So let's try that. So this, effectively we're looking for this to look exactly the same. So we've got that first selection thing working correctly, and the Z index appears to be increasing happily to always put our selected item on the top. So that looks like that has worked. So that's all that I've got for this one. Again, all of the code will be in a GitHub repo linked in the comments, and links to various references that I made use of, and the code will include details of how I got there. Sorry if the lighting has got dodgy, it got kind of dark here, so I had to turn the light on. Thanks for watching again, if you have watched the previous one as well. And again, let me know how you thought I got on in the comments, or if you've got any other ideas for other videos. And thanks for watching.